affiliated Americans, you could consider the resurrection within your own current worldview. And what if you don't believe God exists, and so it seems like there's nothing to cause Jesus to rise from the dead? Well, the resurrection could make you rethink that idea, but I might also argue an argument for the existence of God. This one's called the argument from change. I like it. It goes like this. Change occurs when a potential X becomes an actual Y. We see change all the time. It can be like growth or movement, but no potential X can become an actual Y on its own any more than water can freeze itself or a train car can propel itself. Instead, something like a freezer or a locomotive has to actualize the potential for change. But then these actualizers only change because other things actualize them. So could an infinite series explain why we have change at all? Well, no. Just as an infinitely long train of boxcars would sit motionless without a locomotive, an infinite number of things that must be actualized by something else would be changeless unless there was a cause of the series that's just pure actuality. So just as a locomotive pulls without being pulled, this uncaused cause for the series would actualize everything without being actualized by anything else. It'd be pure actuality. And since the universe contains a mixture of potential and actual, it can't be that
opening. It's not reasonable to believe because there isn't sufficient evidence. There isn't physical evidence. There's none of this. We just have testimonial accounts.
Okay, but part of it is you also said that it's an extraordinary event because resurrections don't happen. They've never been confirmed.
Right.
Okay, how many resurrection claims have you investigated?
Well, just from the Bible, we have Jesus's, Lazarus's, and then all of the saints who rose up out of their graves and marched on Jerusalem in the middle of it. I find no compelling evidence for any of those. There was a resurrection. I'm sorry.
Well, Craig, right. Were you alluding? I'm curious if you have how many. The question is just how many resurrection claims outside of the Bible have you investigated to see if this does happen?
Well, I don't know what we're going to call investigating. I saw a YouTube video that purported to be of a resurrection, but there was no way to investigate it. If there's no way to look into the details, but the notion that someone is willing to die for something testifies to how strongly they believe, how convinced they are, or how convinced they want someone to think they are. It has no bearing on whether or not it's actually true.
Okay, Trent.
All right. Well, two thoughts there, minor and major point. Minor point is with Waco, I actually did a podcast on this from my Council of Trent podcast. I don't think that they committed suicide, frankly. I think they were murdered by the government, but that's
yes.
Maybe talk for another time.
I agree. I think they were forced to stay there.
Oh, right. But yeah, some people could make you think that Koresh did that. I think the government. Anywho, we'll do a separate show on that. I'll go on Atheist Experience. We'll talk about it. Number two,
that's interesting.
I agree that being willing to die for something does not prove the thing you're dying for is true. Being willing to die or be persecuted is a demonstration of sincerity. So I think because of the disciples, their willingness to endure persecution, which we have good evidence from in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, all of his letters, the Acts of the Apostles, biblical works, that the disciples were willing.
Because I'd argue that an untestable claim of a matter of fact, such as this event occurred, no matter what the event is, can never be reasonably believed unless that matter of fact is wholly mundane and when the risk of being wrong is minimized. So if somebody were to say George Washington had a dog named Piggy, the risk of accepting that claim being wrong is fairly trivial. We don't have any way to verify it, as far as I can tell, and it's probably also not falsifiable because we don't have a time machine. We don't have the ability to exhaustively explore every aspect of it. But the risk of being wrong is trivial. Oops, I thought George Washington had a dog named Piggy. Turns out I wasn't right. I guess that's not a big deal. Unless maybe you're on a quiz show in front of millions of people and then you suffer terrible embarrassment and a harm to your reputation. And then all of a sudden, believing something like that is a problem. It's important for people to recognize that there's a difference between verification and falsification. Verification is verification is the concept that we should produce the thing. If we were to say all intelligent beings are on planet Earth, verification, you could run around, hey, there's an intelligent being on Earth, and there's one on Earth, and there's one on Earth, and there's one on Earth. But verifying it exhaustively could be completely impractical because you would have to search every planet at all times in order to determine that, in fact, all intelligent beings are, in fact, on planet Earth. But falsification is a separate issue. Falsification is whether or not it is theoretically able to be shown to be false. And so while we may never be able to verify that all intelligent beings are, in fact, on planet Earth, we could, at least in theory, falsify it, because if we produced an intelligent being that wasn't on Earth, that would falsify the claim. Now, that would show that the claim is wrong. But if we have a claim that is unverifiable, unfalsifiable, it is essentially untestable. And my foundation is that if you have an untestable claim, it had better be mundane, trivial, and consistent with the facts of reality before you should ever risk believing that it is in fact the case. Well, we can't really believe, or we can't argue that it's rational to believe something that we can't test at all. And so we do the best we can when it comes to history. And so when we take a look at history, all we have are reports. Somebody said they saw this, somebody said they knew this person, somebody said this other thing. That's all well and good when we're trying to put together the best understanding of history we can, but we shouldn't be proclaiming it as truth, and we shouldn't necessarily be saying that this particular version of history is particularly reasonable, because history tends to be written by the victors. And so history is always suspect. And there are two quotes from David Hume that are the cornerstone of how and why I go about determining if something is or should be considered reasonable. The first one is that he said, the wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And all he's really saying is your confidence level in the truth of a claim should be proportional to the evidence that is there to support it. You barely have any evidence for. And similarly, if there's mountains of evidence of something and you're just like, well, then you're not proportioning your confidence to the belief, or to the evidence, sorry. The second quote from Hume, which I'll go ahead and read because it's a little lengthy. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should have actually happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. Now, what Hume is essentially saying there is it more probable that someone has either been deceived or is intending to deceive me than the claim is true? And when he says reject the greater miracle, that is incredibly important and significant to understand. Hume is not saying accept the lesser miracle. That is not it at all. It is reject the greater miracle. It's not. It doesn't just say, oh, here's two potential candidate explanations that we have at this particular moment in time. Throw the one out that's more ridiculous and accept the other one. No, it's just you should throw out the one that's more ridiculous. And so if we're hearing a claim that someone rose from the dead, when we have no evidence that this sort of thing is possible or probable, then the greater miracle is that someone rose from the dead versus that someone was deceived or that someone was intending to deceive, that someone was mistaken. Nobody has to lie for any of this. They can just be wrong, or we can just have stories that don't accurately represent the facts at the time. So if a claim isn't falsifiable and there's no way to show it's wrong, we can't reasonably accept that it's correct. And if we're left with no physical evidence about the existence of Jesus or the interactions of Jesus or his death and resurrection, what we're left with is testimony. Now, I'm not willing to dig in on whether or not the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. I don't think they were. I don't think that most reasonable scholars aren't going to say these are eyewitnesses, but it doesn't matter to me because even if they were all eyewitnesses, we already know that eyewitness testimony is unreliable under the best circumstances. In this case, we don't know whose testimony, eyewitness second or third hand. We can't investigate it at all. The things that they say happened don't have corroborating evidence. They don't have supporting physical evidence. We don't have any way to question them about their reliability. We don't have any way to talk to them to determine, are these stories accurate? Do they overlap? What we do know is that the Easter narrative from the different Gospels does not line up and cannot be reconciled with the different accounts of it. But in the absence of any physical evidence, we're left with assessing the nature of the claim and the nature of the reports. If it's an extraordinary claim...
Matt Dillahunty argues that belief only makes sense when a claim can be tested. If it can't be verified or falsified, it isn't knowledge, it's just a story. Saying Washington had a dog named Piggy may be unverifiable, but harmless. Saying a man rose from the dead is another matter. It claims a break in the laws of biology, and that requires hard evidence. Trent Horn nailed this centuries ago. The wise proportion belief to the evidence, and no testimony is enough to establish a miracle unless denying it would be even more miraculous. Testimony alone isn't evidence. And when we look at the resurrection, that's all we have. Late, anonymous gospel accounts that contradict each other on who went to the tomb, what they saw, and when it happened. Paul, writing earlier than the Gospels, never even mentions an empty tomb. Outside the Bible, history is silent. We know eyewitness memory is unreliable even today. Stretched across decades and transmitted through theology, it's worthless as proof. If extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence, Christianity's central claim fails its own test.
Physical understanding of the universe was suspended for an individual based only on testimonial accounts. It is unreasonable. That is how you get conned. That is how magicians fool you. No, I didn't, but it's my time, isn't it?
If you want to pontificate, go ahead.
I did, and now I'm done.
Okay.
Well, Matt, how would you like to proceed?
All right, let me... What
Just discussion time, I was just trying to get the...
Yeah, we'll move into 20 minutes of discussion. I want to kind of maybe kick it off by asking each of you a question. Would that be okay? Trent, do you think that uniformity of the laws of nature provide evidence against miracles?
I think, well, actually, no. The uniformity of the laws of nature are necessary for something to be a miracle. In my opening statement, I gave the example of a life jacket. Like, you notice an orange life jacket because the water around it is totally different. So if you didn't have uniform laws of nature, we wouldn't have any way. The word miracle actually comes from a Greek word that means sign. So if God were to make a sign of his intervention in the world, it'd have to be different from the natural world around us. Otherwise, we just say, oh, well, that's like how everything goes. We wouldn't notice it. So I don't think that it's evidence against it. I think rather that we have to think, okay, well, I agree with Matt. We should try to figure out how the world is, but the world is a strange place. And so there are things that upset the apple cart a bit, and this may be one of them. And so I say, is this an exception to a general rule we have, just like we have discovered other exceptions? For example, for 1,500, and I promise to be done, for 1,500 years in Europe, people thought swans were always white. That was their uniform experience. But then there was testimony in 1697 that black swans had been found in Australia. But it wasn't like, oh, we can't possibly believe that. It's like, oh, we might need a little bit more. But if it's sincere, reliable testimony, that actually shows the world's very different from what we know. And I think the same can be done for the resurrection.
Matt, why don't you respond to that question, then I'll ask you a question and have Trent respond, and then you guys can get into it.
Oh, is this how you want to do it?
Well, this is I just want to ask each of you one question and give you both time to respond, and then I'll let the two of you go at it. So I just wanted to give Matt a chance to respond to you there.
So yeah, I'm in agreement with Trent. The law, in order for something to be considered a miracle, it must violate the laws of nature. There needs to be order in order to recognize the thing that's different. That's not controversial at all. I think it's absolutely hilarious, though, at all the people in chat who are claiming that I'm angry and rude when during my questioning time, I'm just trying to get a question across. It's funny.
No, it's my message to everyone in the chat. That's just how it goes. Actually, I mean, I could drive down. I wish I could drive to Austin. I'm only 3 hours away from you. We could grab a beer or whatnot. It's just, folks. It's
once
just part of
once the quarantine's over, do it.
I will.
Once this quarantine's over, I'm up for my second inoculation in like 2 weeks, I think. We can sit down in the studio and record.
All right,
here's an appointment.
Well, I'm older, so I'm older and diabetic, so I got my appointment.
All right, here's a question for Matt. I'll let you take some time to respond, and then Trent, you can respond to him, and then I'll let the two of you feel free to have a conversation. Matt, can testimonial evidence alone make a belief reasonable?
On its own, no. But testimonial evidence is always viewed within the pool of things we already understand. If you say, I got a new puppy last night, that is reasonable for me to accept because I know that puppies exist and people get them for pets, and there's nothing extraordinary. Everything about your claim is consistent with what I already know and understand to be true about reality via experience and evidence. So it's not, you could view that as, oh, your testimony alone is enough. But that's a colloquial thing. That is us saying, I will take you at your word. But the truth is, when I say that, I'm saying, I will take you at your word, considering all the mountains of evidence I have about how the universe already works.
Trent.
Okay. Yeah, what I would say is that in the vast majority of cases, testimony is sufficient. But in some cases, we might need a little bit more. So I think, for example, look at the resurrection. I think we have very good testimony. So we have testimony going back to St. Paul, who was an eyewitness of the original disciples. So we have good evidence to believe, and even atheistic scholars, as I cited, like Paula Fredrickson and Richard Carrier, and on this, would say that the original disciples claimed Jesus rose from the dead, and this was motivated by a genuine experience that they sincerely thought this had happened. So yeah, I agree. Like a testimonial is something, one person's testimony for the mundane. For something that's extra mundane, I might need more testimony. If it's a group of people and they're willing to suffer costly punishment for affirming this belief, then that starts to raise the likelihood the belief is true. Most things we believe about, nearly everything we believe about the ancient world, for example, is based on testimony. Like I cited in my opening statement, if you went on Matt's conclusion, I mean, he even said it was not reasonable to believe Jesus was crucified. You're going to abandon ancient history and scholarship. It's not reasonable.
All right, I'll let
I said I wasn't convinced it was reasonable. I didn't say it was not reasonable.
All right, we have 18 minutes. I'll let you guys have a conversation, and then we'll have 30 minutes of Q&A after that. So if you're in the live stream right now, just save your questions until that time. All right, guys, go.
Well, how do we do this without? Because I enjoy talking with you, Matt. You're fun.
I do too, and that's I wish people could understand that more. That just because there might be a minute of raw doesn't mean that we're So you talked about having more testimony, and I'm on record as saying the plural of anecdote isn't data. So it doesn't matter how many testimonials you have; that alone is not going to be enough, and unless you view that in the broader stream of things. And the way I've explained this is that, like, my mom. Okay, screw it. I don't like doing this, but my mom is a fundamentalist Southern Baptist Christian who believes she has seen demons.
Okay.
Now, I'm happy to believe that my mom thinks that she has seen something, but that doesn't mean that I'm justified in accepting that that she's correct about what she's seen. Same with people who are abducted by aliens, or claim. I'm sorry, people who claim they're abducted by aliens.
Well, so it sounds like your epistemology. Because if you notice in my opening statement, I didn't use like natural, supernatural. I used usual, unusual. Because like alien abduction, that's a natural occurrence.
Well, what's the difference between there are plenty of things that are unusual in my life, but usual and unusual. Unusual is like that's a wide spectrum to go from, hey, it's unusual for somebody to win the lottery, even though it happens all the time. Somebody was raised from the dead.
I guess what do alien abductions, resurrection claims, it seems like what they have in common is they're disputed and they don't happen very often. That seems to be like just basically what they have in common. So like, what would we use to determine when would it be reasonable for someone to think they had an encounter with an extraterrestrial being, I guess?
I don't know what it would take. See, here's the thing. We're talking about two different things. What would it take for, like, if I had an experience that I was convinced was being abducted by aliens, that is independent from what it would take for you to believe that I actually was abducted by aliens.
Okay. I mean, what if you told me you had been abducted by aliens and you called me and like I talked to you at 9:00 at night and you're in Texas, and then you call me at 3 a.m. and you say I was abducted by aliens and they dropped me off in Tokyo. And like,
well, hang on,
an airline ticket.
You just invented something that has potential physical evidence that's completely different. You added something to the story.
Well, I'd be adding more testimony. Like there'd be people who would say, like, I saw Matt, your Japanese fans be like, I saw Matt Dillahunty in Tokyo. And
It's not just, oh, I saw Matt in Tokyo. We could prove that I was in Tokyo.
Okay, so if that okay, let's just say we have the physical evidence there. Would you then be allowed to go through this reasoning process? I can't provide explanation for how I got to Tokyo, so it must be an extraterrestrial explanation.
No, that's a fallacy.
Well, then how would that circumstance with the physical evidence convince you you'd been abducted?
No.
It wouldn't.
No, if my position is I don't have an explanation for how this happened, I don't get to invent one, and I don't get to claim it's aliens or angels or gods or demons or anything. If I don't have an explanation, then I don't have an explanation. And as much as that sucks, that's the truth.
So even if there was Independence Day spaceships over the Earth, would that? I'm picking aliens because I'm just saying this isn't a natural supernatural question. I'm trying to figure out, like you say, we don't have sufficient evidence for the resurrection, but if you can't tell...
Matt Dillahunty lays out a clear standard. Testimony by itself is never enough to justify a claim that suspends the known order of reality. Testimonial accounts can only be trusted when they align with what is already established. If someone says they adopted a puppy, the claim fits a framework of knowledge backed by everyday evidence. Puppies exist, people adopt them. But when someone claims a man returned from the dead, testimony alone collapses under the weight of what we know about biology. Without corroborating evidence, it remains only a story, preserved through repetition rather than demonstration. Trent Horn responds that testimony is the backbone of what we know about the past. Nearly everything about ancient history, he argues, is preserved through testimony. He claims the Gospels and Paul provide very good testimony. Disciples who sincerely believed in the resurrection, experiences that motivated costly sacrifices, traditions handed down without interruption. Horn maintains that willingness to endure punishment, combined with multiple testimonies, elevates the resurrection beyond myth and secures it as a credible historical event in ways other ancient stories supposedly do not. The problem is that sincerity, numbers, and costliness have never been reliable measures of truth. People have surrendered their lives to false beliefs throughout history. The followers of Jim Jones drank poison in Jonestown, convinced of salvation. Members of Heaven's Gate died believing a comet would carry them to another realm. Medieval villagers swore they saw witches and spirits, and their testimony condemned innocents to death. Conviction shows belief, not truth, and history demonstrates this lesson with brutal clarity. Psychology confirms this. Human memory is unreliable, shaped by suggestion, repetition, stress, and group influence. Eyewitness confidence often grows stronger even as accuracy deteriorates. That is why courts no longer rely on testimony alone. Physical evidence is required for serious claims. The biblical accounts bear the same weaknesses. The Gospels were written decades after the events, in Greek, by unknown authors outside Palestine. They diverge on crucial points: who visited the tomb, when it occurred, what was found. Paul, our earliest source, never mentions an empty tomb. His experience of Christ was visionary, not historical. Outside the New Testament, no contemporaneous record exists. Josephus was altered by later Christians, and Tacitus simply reported what Christians already believed within their own circles. Dillahunty points out that multiplying testimonies doesn't transform them into evidence. 100 anecdotes remain anecdotes. Without physical evidence or consistent accounts, the resurrection remains a story, not a fact. The issue is not whether people believed it happened. The issue is whether it actually happened. Until extraordinary claims are backed by extraordinary evidence, they remain unverified assertions. Why should ancient testimony be given a pass we deny to every other extraordinary claim?
This comes from Jimmy McDermott. Trent, what do you think of the argument that if Jesus was born in the modern day, it would be easier and more reasonable for us to prove it? Video, for example. Seems like bad timing on God's part.
Well, these kinds of arguments, and Matt alluded to one in the debate, like, well, if God existed, then he would provide a different kind of evidence to show that he exists and that he loves us. But that's a claim, it's an assertion. I don't see the evidence for that. all we need to say is, well, does God have good reasons for revealing himself in the way he does? Even if Jesus were to appear today, he would have missed the billions of people that lived in the past 2,000 years. You might say, why doesn't he go back 50,000 years? Well, it's good he appeared in a time and place with riding and Roman roads and things like that, so that eventually Christianity would become the largest religion in the world and 2 billion people would believe it. But even if he appeared today, I mean, the fact is Matt has not said what would convince him. Even if you gave something over the top, Matt has never said, oh yeah, that would convince me. Even if he showed up today, there would still be people, if they have the bar set too high, they wouldn't believe. Instead of talking about the evidence we wish we had, it's better to talk about the evidence we do have and then subject it to see if it is reasonable.
Okay, Matt.
So, yeah, first of all, I didn't say that God would give better evidence. I said he could give better evidence. It's not my position to tell you what God would or wouldn't do. But I would argue that a case for a reasonable God who purportedly wants us all to know him and love him and understand him would give the sort of evidence. And for Trent or anybody else to just assert that, or suggest that either I or somebody else has the bar too high and no amount of evidence would be enough, that is absolutely ignoring the fact that I've already acknowledged that God could absolutely, without question, provide sufficient evidence to convince even me, and it hasn't happened.
Okay, we got a question here from Anglican Aesthetics, and I might have a follow-up to this because I think you've addressed this already, Matt. You said, this bloke says, we don't have physical evidence that Hannibal crossed the Alps. Would you say that historical event is therefore dubious?
So first of all, I'm not absolutely confident about anything. And so my confidence level in particular claims is always proportional to the claim. I don't know enough about this claim to establish a confidence level or say whether or not I believe it. I haven't spent any time at all studying it. But to say that somebody crossed the Alps, we know people have, or there's evidence of other people crossing it. So then it becomes a question of timing and method and all of that. And if the story is that Hannibal crossed the Alps on a flying giraffe, okay, well, I'm more dubious of that than on an elephant or at some other time. So I can't tell you whether or not I'm convinced it exists because you're presenting something that I haven't spent any time at all looking into.
Here's a follow-up question, because it sounds like you're saying, okay.
Do I respond to that, Matt?
I'll give you plenty of time to do that, Trent. I just wanted to have a quick follow-up here. It sounds like you're saying, we experience these things, they're not outside of our everyday experience, therefore it's easier for me to accept. So here's a question, like, what is maybe the strangest thing that you think is still reasonable that you accept? Does that make sense, that you don't have immediate access to epistemologically?
Yeah, I don't know if I could. I'd have to spend some time thinking about it to figure out what's the strangest. Maybe if somebody made a list, I could pick what's the strangest. But I will say that unlike a lot of other people, I don't accept string theory, partly because I don't understand it well enough, and partly because, or string theory and multiverse, both of these are speculative things that I'm not convinced are falsifiable and fully testable. That doesn't mean I think they're wrong. It doesn't mean that I'm considering and say that didn't happen. I'm just talking about I don't know enough and haven't found the evidence for them particularly compelling. It's a sort of speculative endeavor. And so there are many strange things like coincidences. I've experienced things that, as far as I can tell, are extraordinary coincidences. You know, I was thinking about somebody and I picked up the phone to call them. I was thinking about my mom and I picked up the phone to call my mom and there was no dial tone. And it's because my mom had called me, and before the phone even rang, I happened to pick it up in that gap, and so we were connected. And this is the sort of thing that my mom would be like, oh, it was Jesus. God has connected us. And for me, it's like, I believe that it's a curious coincidence, but I don't know how you reach the conclusion that the best explanation is Jesus wanted us to talk on the phone.
Trent, I'll give you 2 minutes since I gave Matt a twofer there. Go for it.
Sure. One, I would say, I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said coincidences are God's attempt at humor. So I don't know what to think about that. And that might be wrong. This is from the guy who wrote a book on what the saints never said. I don't know. He might not have said that, but somebody said it. I said it. But coincidences, like for me, like I think, yeah, when Christians are like, oh, look at this amazing coincidence. It's not great evidence for God because we have this thing called the law of large numbers. Like if there's billions of people, there's bound to be weird coincidences. I need the evidence bar to be higher, and I think I've shown it for the thing we're arguing for today. Number two, you asked Matt Dillahunty about what's the strangest thing you believe in what's the strangest thing out there that's reasonable? So for me, I would say belief in a multiverse and belief that extraterrestrial beings live somewhere in the universe. I'm not necessarily fully convinced of them. I don't think it's unreasonable to believe that, given the size of the universe and given the nature of inflationary cosmology. So, I mean, those, for me to answer that question, I guess that's two. And yeah, I just think the world is a super duper strange place, and we're always learning new things. I mean, prior to 1982, we didn't know that people could come back from clinical death after failed CPR. It's called Lazarus syndrome, seen about 30 times. But I mean, like 200 years ago, people didn't know about that. So would you not believe someone came back from clinical death if you had a chat with them? Like, if we have too narrow view, like reality has to be whatever's consistent about it. How do we know we have a consistent nature of reality? We're finite. Maybe there's a counterexample staring us in the face. As for Hannibal, I believe the Hannibal account, even though there's less evidence for the March of the War Elephants in particular, even though it wouldn't fit Matt's standards, because the Roman historian Polybius wrote about it 60 years later. It's secondhand. It's highly unusual. It sounds like the stuff of legends. We got a few coins minted in Spain that might have pictures of elephants at the same time, but that's circumstantial. But that's my best to get all three of those in one answer.
All right, Trent, let me ask you more of a psychological question, so for what it's worth. Suppose, because you had a conversion, it seems, you believed in sort of deistic God, and then you came to accept Christianity. Do you honestly think that if you didn't believe in God, that the evidence for the resurrection, as you are putting it forth now, would convince you of the resurrection of Christ, or would that just not be a live option for you?
Well, I don't. It's hard for me to think, what would I think if I had been different?
Yeah,
that's a hard question to answer. Although I think there is a philosophical view called modal realism that says parallel worlds exist and all these counterfactuals really exist out there. I don't think it's an unreasonable thing to argue for, even though we don't have empirical evidence for it. It explains why these counterfactuals are true. But yeah, for me, what made me open to the resurrection was that there was a God who was capable of doing this. So I do believe that miracles can move people into believing in God. Some people, that's reasonable for them. I wasn't really wired that way. Like, I had always, like, my background, I was never an atheist, but I believed in a distant deistic God who struck the cue ball, and that's it. That was that. I wasn't Christian. So seeing better evidence for God, he's more of the theistic God, that made it more plausible for me to accept the resurrection. So if I didn't believe in God, I think I would have a harder time believing in the resurrection. That's why when I share the faith, I try to give philosophical arguments for the existence of God and historical arguments that this God revealed himself. That's my particular method.
Feel free to respond there, Matt.
Sure. I'll hit a couple things really quick. First of all, I'm with Trent on the Drake equation and the likelihood of aliens. I just don't consider that strange. When I look at the enormity of the universe, it would be stranger that the Drake equation and other things didn't suggest that there's potentially other life out there. I still don't know how we falsify this claim of the resurrection of Jesus, but Trent's talking about whether or not he would believe the evidence that he's presented now. I used to believe this, like and not just because I walked down the aisle at the age of 5 in a Southern Baptist church, although I'm sure that had something to do with it and all the people around me believed it. But I thought, hey, when I read the Bible, I'm reading reliable accounts that are necessarily accurate because there's a God who's preserved the word. As soon as I realized that I didn't have a good reason to believe that, and people are like, oh, well, there's your problem, it all crumbles. Because if there's not this foundational thing that the words in this particular book or this particular collection of books are being vouchsafed by the eternal creator of the universe, then they become as suspect as anything else. And I have to view them that way. I have no choice but to view them that way. And I think that if we were all to acknowledge the truth of this, that we all have our biases. And while I have escaped one set of bias, moving from a bias towards Christianity, now I have a science bias. And the difficulty for many people is recognizing that my science bias may in fact be the foundation of the most reasonable position.
Okay, thanks. Okay, question here. Matt, isn't it arrogant to hold...
Trent Horn claims that Jesus appeared during the Roman era because roads, trade, and empire allowed Christianity to spread widely. He presents this as providence, a deliberate choice by God to ensure the message would reach future generations. Matt Dillahunty answers by pointing out that a God who intends for all people to know him has the ability to provide clear, testable evidence accessible across cultures, languages, and centuries. What history contains instead are accounts written decades after the events, authored by people whose identities remain unknown. The Gospel of Mark ends with silence from the women at the tomb. Matthew includes an earthquake and angels. Luke describes the disciples dismissing the women's report. John gives Mary Magdalene a personal encounter with Jesus. Paul, the earliest Christian writer, does not describe an empty tomb at all. Outside the Bible, the record contains no contemporary documentation. The Josephus passage was altered by later Christians, and Tacitus only repeats claims already circulating among believers nearly a century later. Dillahunty stresses that testimony alone cannot establish fact. Modern legal systems require physical corroboration because memory is unreliable and shaped by pressure, repetition, and belief. History provides numerous examples of people swearing to events that lacked evidence. Witch trials in Salem, Joseph Smith's golden plates, claims of alien abduction, Marian apparitions in Fatima. Personal conviction never transformed those accounts into verifiable truth. The central issue is not whether early Christians believed the resurrection. The central issue is whether it occurred. The surviving material consists of late writings, contradictions, and theological interpretation without supporting evidence. If divine revelation is intended for all people, it should not rest on stories alone. What's your take on this? Do you think morality depends on religion, or can ethics and compassion stand on their own? Drop your ideas in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to keep the discussion alive.